We deserve to risk ourselves in that way, giving her life to remind you of the value of yours. Just as the facts of history alone do not teach morality, what is unethical? A dying with dignity video. Purpose, autonomy, dignity, feeling like a burden, because my life is not mine to take, it's mine to give. And because how a story ends changes the meaning of every page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ever Living Podcasts. We are your life-loving hosts this week, Xindi
and Jason.
And welcome back, everyone. It's good to see you. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting New Hampshire Right-to-Life. Today we have a very exciting guest from Canada. Her name is Amanda Achtman, and she is the founder of Dying to Meet You. Let's welcome Amanda.
Thank you.
Hi, Amanda. How are you?
Great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us what is Dying to Meet You project, and how did you get that started?
Sure. Well, Dying to Meet You is a project of cultural renewal to humanize our conversations on suffering, death, meaning, and hope. Because in my home country of Canada, euthanasia has become a massive crisis to the extent that 1 in 20 deaths is caused by a doctor or nurse deliberately ending a patient's life. And so I have followed this closely for the past decade since legalization in 2016. And what is needed is cultural renewal, because this is not so much a medical issue and crisis as it is an existential crisis. And we'll get into why that is. But just to kind of indicate where we're going, the main reasons why people are asking for euthanasia, assisted suicide, medical aid in dying are really connected to meaning, purpose, autonomy, dignity, feeling like a burden, these kinds of things. And so it takes a very comprehensive outlook toward the cry of the heart and toward what is at stake here. And that's what enthuses me as someone who cares deeply and who actually sees the prevention of euthanasia and the encouragement of hope as a kind of quintessential form of patriotism that I, as a Canadian, am being summoned to right now.
You say a quintessential form of patriotism. Is that because it's protecting the lives of Canadians and can you explain?
Sure. Well, Canada has become a cautionary tale to the world because we really are the euthanasia capital of the world. The uptake, the popularity of euthanasia now is such that other jurisdictions are looking to Canada and wondering what is up with Canada. And so I say a matter of patriotism because I also love studying history, and historical examples and role models remind me that the truest patriotism consists in loving your country more than your government does. And I think with euthanasia, with assisted suicide, we have seen a kind of conceding and capitulating to suicidal ideation that does not actually correspond to the values of Canadians, values of compassion, of civic mindedness. And so it's recapturing what it means to look out for one another, to take care of one another in this climate that is not just very cold in our long winters, but that can be a little bit cold relationally. So how do we revive the warmth of those human relations that actually help protect life? Because otherwise, if the circumstances are cold and callous, then people really do just increase their requests to have their lives ended when life feels dark or bleak.
So Amanda, I want to go back to something you said a little earlier. Is that you said that the reasons that people do euthanasia are things like autonomy. That doesn't match with what I've heard here in New Hampshire when they've had bills over the last couple of years. They keep saying, "Oh, they're in such dire pain that, and they have to have a 6-month prognosis to live or less." Can you just address like some of those reasons?
Sure.
Why people use euthanasia?
Yeah, so when Canada first legalized it, and I'll make this point as well, we call it medical aid in dying, or it's abbreviated to this euphemistic acronym MAID. And that term was coined to encompass both euthanasia and assisted suicide. And there is a distinction between these two. Euthanasia is where the doctor or nurse deliberately, through a lethal injection, ends the patient's life. And assisted suicide is where the patient has to self administer. And in the 13 US states, there's only assisted suicide, and that's why the numbers are lower. In Canada, almost every instance is that direct euthanasia. No one self-administers really when given the option to have a doctor or nurse do it to them. So that also kind of undercuts the autonomy because there's always a medical practitioner who's implicated. But back to legalization in 2016. Initially, it was expected to be rare and for extenuating circumstances. There was criteria like grievous and irremediable medical conditions. No specific timeline for prognosis, but still the sense that death was imminent in a certain sense, at least reasonably foreseeable, also a bit of a vague term, but this was the thinking. But here's the thing. Once euthanasia is accepted for those cases, it becomes tantamount to a right, and rights need to be expanded in order to satisfy our value of equality. And so the rationale that led to our euthanasia expansion in 2021 is that surely if physical pain and suffering is the criterion, we know that there are people who suffer as much, if not more, physically of disabilities, chronic illnesses, and neurological conditions, those are the three, earlier in their life. And so why wouldn't they have access if they could be suffering just as much? And so it was expanded on the grounds of equality. But at the same time, that wasn't going far enough, according to our Senate. The Senate said, likewise, there are people who are suffering as much, if not more, psychologically due to mental illness. And so we also have to expand it as a matter of equality to people whose sole underlying condition is a mental illness. And so on March 17th, 2021, the euthanasia expansion was signed into law, expanding euthanasia on the basis of disability, so-called Track 2 MAID, whereas Track 1 is the reasonably foreseeable death track, and mental illness as a sole condition. However, that second category, the mental illness one, has not been implemented. Its implementation has been delayed and delayed and delayed, and hopefully will be delayed indefinitely. But technically, the law did pass, and if not for an act of legislation, Canada is set to begin euthanizing people whose sole underlying condition is a mental illness, beginning on March 17th, 2027. Of course, I hope that will not take effect. So yes, these were the reasons people anticipated physical suffering. But the thing is, by and large, that with adequate palliative care, pain can be managed, even with opportunities like palliative sedation that can really, really manage the pain without deliberately killing the person and ending their life. The reasons why people want euthanasia, though they may have something like cancer or ALS or Parkinson's and these very serious illnesses, are really the existential pain. So while the qualifying condition may be a serious illness, and often needs to be a serious illness, if you listen to their own reasons, which Health Canada publishes in an annual report, the number one kind of suffering by people's own admission who are actually pursuing it is a loss of the ability to participate in meaningful life activities. That's number one. The second one is the inability to perform the daily activities of personal care, followed by loss of dignity, loss of autonomy. These are not reasons of extreme physical pain or agony. They are existential reasons. And so I find this immensely interesting and this is why I say we need a project of cultural renewal, because what we're seeing is a specific form of suicidal ideation that jeopardizes life during certain seasons of life, of aging, of disability, of vulnerability. And this matters to all of us because it's not like there are two kinds of people in the world, vulnerable and invulnerable, disabled and able-bodied. As the disability rights community likes to say, we're all tabs, temporarily able-bodied. And we are all vulnerable at different moments of our lives. And so what kind of society are we going to create? From my perspective, I think what is most shattering is not receiving a very difficult medical diagnosis, but how it's interpreted by those around you. We can bear anything if it's met with love, accompaniment, and support. But if that diagnosis is followed by the suggestion that, well, you could just die, or you could be excluded from the human community because you fit the criteria for a state sponsored suicide program, that is worse than any news of a diagnosis itself, even of a terminal diagnosis. It is so much more crushing to suggest death to someone
Yeah.
than anything else. So that's what gets me so fired up about this.
Yes. That in Canada, that people would feel abandoned, would feel just, you know, this is the option. Like that is very, I feel, unloving to the whole population, to the people who need the most love at that moment in time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you have any stories that you could share with our listeners about people you've met, families you've met over the past 10 years in the Dying to Meet You project?
Yeah, stories every day. And I'll begin by sharing the story of Miriam. Miriam is a woman I met recently on Vancouver Island, and after one of my talks, she told me that she was offered MAID unprompted, practically upon arrival to the hospital. She was in excruciating pain suddenly. It was pain that she'd never experienced before, and her daughter quickly called an ambulance and she was rushed to the hospital. And she told me that as soon as she arrived, this woman basically took a look at her, realized she's 84 years old and in agony, and said, "We would like to offer you MAID." Before there was an x-ray done, before she knew anything about what was wrong with her. And she said, that was the last thing on my mind. I just wanted to find out what was at issue. And her family was with her, so they can corroborate the story, and they have in the media. She was so taken aback. And while it did take a month for her to recover, she recuperated very well, and within a year had traveled to Mexico, Cuba, and Guatemala. And when she told me this story, I was, of course, floored. There is no prohibition right now on raising MAID, on suggesting euthanasia. In fact, the Canadian Association of MAID Providers and Assessors says you can bring it up, and you ought to bring it up with anyone who's eligible. And with such a wide eligibility, people like Miriam are met with the suggestion of death rather than a look of treatment and care. So when she shared the story with me, I asked if she would be willing to share it on camera. And she said, yeah, what do I have to lose? Why not? And so I stepped out of the room with her, and she just told me the story as I shared it with you now. And I uploaded it to X, and it quickly received more than 300,000 views. And
Wow.
many people around the world began to pay attention, and she started to get calls for media requests, basically. She was on the front page of Canada's National Post, a major national paper here. There was a story in City News Vancouver. Her own city came and interviewed her. And then the story, to my great surprise, was picked up by People, New York Post, Daily Mail,
Wow.
outlets that are not especially friendly to necessarily a pro-life perspective. And they all love this story because she's this protagonist. Here's this woman who is climbing a volcano in Guatemala. And so the cover of the National Post said, a doctor offered her MAID, but she had other plans. So what a
Yeah.
life-affirming
Wow.
story. Well, just yesterday, a member of parliament was speaking to his bill, a bill that would be a step toward preventing MAID coercion in Canada. And he acknowledged her in the speech. And Miriam's daughter was actually in the gallery visiting from BC. She happened to be in Ottawa, and so she was able to receive the applause of the House when hearing about all of these things that she and her mother are now doing together in these additional days and really years of life that they continue to enjoy. So that's one example of how the pressure that the euthanasia suggestion has on seniors. And I'll also say it was very moving that City News Vancouver, the journalist who had first told Miriam's story, I noticed the very next week had done another profile of a different family who had come forward and said, even though this
Oh.
incident happened a couple years ago and we didn't think of kind of resurfacing the trauma of this negative episode, Miriam's story inspired us to come forward. And that's why I say that there is going to be a kind of Me Too moment with MAID in Canada, because there's this ripple effect of people beginning to open up and tell their stories, that what is shameful and demoralizing becomes a basis for these protagonists of our senior citizens to come forward and say, heck no, I'm going to live. Don't suggest death to me. I have so much more to live and to give. So that's just one example of the impact on seniors. And I think that's very important, because I would stress that simply being offered euthanasia already kills the person. It already defeats and deflates a person's sense of self-worth and of being valued. So that's why it must not even be a suggestion. And telling people that they're eligible, I don't want to fit the criteria that tells me I'm eligible. That is demoralizing. So again, these are matters of interpretation. What do things mean? Because in every society, a diagnosis does not mean the same thing. Being elderly does not mean the same thing. We get to decide, what does it mean to be elderly? Are you revered or are you discarded? There's a huge spectrum of treatment. And again, this is why it's a task of cultural renewal. I want to promote the reverence of life, especially among the elderly. That's so important. But as a young person, relatively, I mean, given the topic, one of the main ways that I come across these stories is because my friends are losing their grandparents to euthanasia. And I created a short film of my friend Benjamin, and he starts off by saying, we're here because 2 out of 4 of my grandparents died by euthanasia within 2 months of each other. He sent a text in a group chat in September and said, friends, my grandmother has gone through with MAID. Pray for me. This has been really difficult. And of course, they all sent their condolences and reached out to him. 2 months later, he put a message in the same group chat saying, friends, my grandmother has died by euthanasia. And people found it a little odd. Like, we know, and we're sad, but he's like, no, the other grandmother, the second grandmother. And so, like, this was so affecting. And then when I shared his story, then someone else came up to me after a talk and said, before I heard you speak, I did not feel permission to grieve, because everyone tells me a certain script that I have to accept that this was the most reasonable death for my grandparent, but it's not. And so rather than being compassionate and accompanying to soften the blow that euthanasia is in people's lives, people actually are affirmed and validated and vindicated in the unique grief that euthanasia results in when we tell the truth about why this death is unlike any other. And I'll say, just the other day, I was speaking with a gentleman whose mother sadly was euthanized during the pandemic. And this man shared that he had lost his sister to a car accident when, like in childhood, and that his father had died when he was a teenager. And he said, compared to their deaths, my mother's death does not compare. It was so much worse, he said, his mother's death, because the others, there was nothing that you could have done. They were not preventable. But his mother's death, that was how the word he used to distinguish. He said, "But my mother's death was preventable. Theirs was not." And so, even though she was elderly and had lived a long life, he was able to grieve so much more naturally the loss of his little sister and of his father at these young ages of his life, because of the difference. So I think as we start to unpack the significance, the social toll, the cultural consequences, the whole conversation becomes very, very different. And that's why I stay engaged in this issue. It's not a policy question for a moment. Even if euthanasia was illegal tomorrow, we would still have so many of these philosophical questions about what it means to be a person. And that's what keeps me engaged in this really for the long run and with enthusiasm.
So Amanda, if we could just hone in on something you said there. You said uh, you were talking about, kind of, if I can paraphrase, the intrinsic value of life and why we grieve when somebody takes their own life. Why, why do you think that is? Why do you think that is so hard?
Yeah, as Benjamin, the one who lost both of his grandmothers, put it, I think he just puts it so well and so poignantly when he says it's the choice of MAID that hurts. The choice wounds us because it's a rejection of us. Like G.K. Chesterton talks about this in his book Orthodoxy. He says that when the one who dies by suicide destroys all possible worlds, like there's a real destructiveness of and a real renunciation of all that is life, of all that is good. It's a repudiation, it's a rejection, it's a spurning of reality and of uh, of the community. And so it's very high stakes in that way, and we feel it. We feel this loss that the world is deprived. Like I love the Jewish saying that like he who saves one life saves the whole world. Well, if we lose a person, we've lost an entire world too. And so do we sense the tremendous, do we quiver and tremble at the loss of a whole world when a life is omitted from the human family in a way that was preventable, in a way that leaves us wondering for the rest of our lives, what could I have done better? What could I have done differently? And so one of my friends, she says, to those in her life who might be tempted to this, she insists, it would be a mercy for you not to go through with this and leave me wondering for the rest of my life what I did wrong. So I think that just begins to get to it. But these are not syllogistic, axiomatic matters. These are, for example, matters for which you shouldn't really use words like that. They are matters of the heart. They are matters of affection, of closeness, of sincerity, of relationship that you can't script and you can't preempt. And yet, I find in the conversations that I have, people are grasping for a language. Just today, this morning, I was at a seniors ministry meeting, and someone came up to me and said, I'm at the gym, and this person tells me I want MAID as soon as I can't do this or that. And this woman who was sharing with me said, and so I told her, well, that goes against my beliefs. That's not what I would do. And she felt that was inadequate. She knew that that was not sufficient. And I said, well, this is a good intuition. And what I would encourage you to say is something that stakes your very self on their good. That stakes your very self on their good by saying, I would be crushed if you did that, or I hope you never go through with it. A lot of times when I'm speaking to older people, which is most of the time, it's kind of my target audience, many people are thinking about euthanasia. They're quite tempted to it, or they want it kind of in the back of their mind in case certain conditions are met. And sometimes I just say, either one-on-one or to an entire audience, I hope from the bottom of my heart that you never go through with this, with euthanasia, with medical aid in dying, with suicide. I hope you never do it. With all my heart, I hope this for you.
Yeah.
And it's dramatic, but like sometimes I'm the only person in their life who they will ever hear that from. And so we deserve to risk ourselves in that way. It's so good to risk ourselves in that way. And I say, let it come back to you, to my audiences, especially of seniors. I say, you might be tempted to this, but one day when you are, think back to this occasion where you had this person in front of you who could have been doing anything else, but who chose to spend this time giving her life to remind you of the value of yours. And that affects people. So we have to risk ourselves and stake our very heart on their good in a way that is so lovingly insistent, that even makes use of affectionate pressure. Because what people want is not indifference and apathy. We don't want to be met with, you do you, especially as we age and suffer certain things. We don't want indifference, we want love. We want that loving insistence that says, stay with me, remain with me. So yeah, so this takes some exercising as well of the conversations, even as such conversations are so intimate and tender as to never be able to be reduced to talking points or even guidelines. and yet they demand a kind of practice and exercise in order to do it with the constancy that this cry of the heart is actually asking of us right now.
Yeah. I think that can tie, like, it kind of can tie euthanasia and pro-life and abortion. It can tie all of that by saying, like, we care about you. We care about you. We care about your child. We care about your life. We care about, you know, it's not just this is right, this is wrong, but it's like you're so important. You know, you are not alone. Like,
Mm.
we want to be here for you. Like, we care about you.
Yeah.
But Jason, do you want to share the card that you received for New Hampshire Right to Life this week, about a woman's family story in New Hampshire?
So this is just completely coincidental, but we received a card from someone who said, my father was euthanized, and she said that her father was given too much medication, and that I think another child, a sibling who probably had, I'm guessing, had like power or was a healthcare proxy, had cut off the medications, but that he was otherwise pretty healthy. But then because the medications were cut off, um, and the pain medications were increased, he was essentially killed. Um, what would you say to somebody like that in that
Of course,
situation?
I don't know the exact details. I do hear from families who have this concern about how their loved one was treated. I would say, at least in Canada, the way in which euthanasia is done is very specific. It's three drugs that basically sedate and paralyze and stop the heart within fewer than 10 minutes often. Um, and then sometimes people are wondering, was there an overdose of morphine? Was that the same as MAID? Was that euthanasia? And so what I do see more and more is the blurring of palliative care measures and direct explicit euthanasia. It's true that when some drugs are overdosed, which is basically made as an overdose of drugs that are used within other contexts appropriately, when drugs are administered in a way to cause death, that is euthanasia. And yet we must maintain a distinction between palliative care drugs that have a wide array of uses and possibilities that are not only listed, but that very much address that physical pain in a way that the person deserves. And I think the distinction lies in keeping the person's good at the center. What is in the person's interest? Alleviating their pain is in their interest. Alleviating it to the extent they don't exist anymore, not in their interest. And so we really have to understand the circumstances, the intention, and also the specific kind of administration of medications or that kind of thing in order to make judgments. And that's why, yes, many people share personal stories, and of course I cannot know all the ins and outs, but what I can know for certainty is having a euthanasia society where 1 in 20 deaths is caused deliberately certainly obfuscates people's sense of the care that their loved ones are receiving, makes them much more nervous justifiably, and leaves people in this confusion and opaqueness about what really happened to their family member. That is so unfair, but it is a necessary consequence of widespread euthanasia. And that's just one reason. There are many why euthanasia concerns more than those who are opting for it, because it has these effects society wide. For example, euthanasia does undermine the doctor patient relationship, it erodes patient trust. It shatters a lot of medical professionals to lose their patients. Often, family doctors are losing their patient who they've followed for many years, and a MAID provider is swooping in and taking the life of that long term patient of a family doctor. So, the devaluation of people with disabilities, like these are all implicit side effects of a widespread euthanasia, and why we can insist that it's not just a matter of individualism or autonomy, it has a social cost big time.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, So 10 years since Canada, was it legalized euthanasia? So are you talked a little bit, but do you see like a pushback from the people? Do you see a pushback from, I don't know, some politicians? Do you see like people speaking against this, people wanting better? Like, do you see, and how does Dying to Meet You project fit in with that? And how can, these are a lot of questions, but like,
Yeah.
what can people do? Like,
Sure.
how can we turn this ship around?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The way that euthanasia was legalized was by creating an exception to the criminal code offense of homicide. That's a unique way in which it was done in Canada. And so if you go under Criminal Code of Canada, homicide, it says no doctor or nurse is culpable for homicide if they have done medical assistance in dying in accordance with the rule. So basically, I think we need to revive the public awareness that this is homicide, that has become non-culpable homicide under our law, but it is still this act that prior would have been prosecuted prior to this change. So I think some clarity about what is actually happening with euthanasia, because when we use euphemisms like MAID, it sounds very sanitized, it sounds very, but we don't know what this experience is actually like for the person undergoing it. There's a lot of speculation, but we just don't know. And it's not something that you want to be flippant with. Now in Canada, it has really gone from exceptional to routine, and we have had more than 100,000 people die by euthanasia. So almost everyone knows someone who has been affected. And sadly, I do think that leads to a lot of attempts to justify, or a lot of kind of self-protective normalization of it, or trying to say, well, I loved this person, and like I don't want to believe that they died by suicide, and so I need to tell a different story to myself in order to contend with this particular grief. So those are some of the challenges that make recognizing the reality of this a little bit more difficult. And yet we do have some good news all the time. I think every story that is shared, like Miriam's, awakens consciences across the country. And recently, the province of Alberta, which I'm proud to be from, so born and raised Calgarian, the Alberta government introduced a bill, and it's just on its way to being made into law, Bill 18, which restricts euthanasia. It's the first kind of legal measure to make a change and say, well, you don't have to accept the status quo. So Alberta is requiring a 12-month prognosis or less for those track 1 terminally ill patients, whereas the federal legislation doesn't specify any timeline. They are also scrapping track 2 euthanasia, meaning that if your only condition is a disability or a chronic illness or a neurological condition, you're not going to qualify and to have your life ended through this state-sponsored suicide program. So that is significant, and that is something that the disability rights community is certainly being grateful for, but also all of us deserve to be grateful for. Alberta is also banning the advertising of MAID in retirement homes or other places like that, and is requiring patients to initiate the conversations rather than having doctors or nurses raise it. So they're doing a lot of kind of commonsensical improvements. Still, it's incremental, but we can accept that it's a step in a positive direction. Alberta is also preemptively and proactively banning euthanasia for children, for those whose sole underlying illness is a mental illness, and for people who don't have capacity to make their own healthcare decisions. It's probably just shocking to hear as I explain that these are the kind of things that they're looking to preempt, but those are where we see the greatest risk of the law being expanded, and where, in fact, the euthanasia lobbyists most want to go. The proponents of euthanasia want what they call MAID for mature minors, which is euthanasia for children.
Oh,
Up.
no.
And the biggest risk right now, I will say, is euthanasia for people living with dementia. Now, right now, as we speak, there's a parliamentary committee unfolding around MAID for mental illness. And interestingly, there seems to be an emerging consensus that we ought not to do this expansion of euthanasia to those whose sole underlying illness is a mental illness, and that must be scrapped before it is set to take effect. There seems to be agreement between the government and the opposition parties, and so I expect that that will be done away with, and that will save a lot of lives and be a big relief from our perspective. However, there is much less advocacy for people with dementia. And if you were to poll Canadians, many would oppose euthanasia for depression, and many would support euthanasia for someone with dementia by advance request. And so right now in Canada, we have a French province. It's our second most populous province, Quebec. And Quebec, as of October 30th, 2024, legalized euthanasia by advance request, meaning upon a diagnosis of dementia, as long as you have not lost the capacity to consent, you can submit a request ahead of time according to certain specifications that you outline subjectively, that once you meet that, you would be euthanized, even if you're no longer able to consent in the moment. So the lack of giving contemporaneous consent is not a problem anymore in Quebec. And the federal justice minister wrote to Quebec and said, what you're doing is against federal law. We're not going to prosecute. In fact, we're going to do a poll across Canada and survey people on whether advance requests would be welcome nationwide. And so my warning to pro-life groups across North America, and there are others making this appeal as well, is what are we going to do for the demographic who I would say is maybe beside the unborn, the most at risk and kind of voiceless, and the most at risk of being discarded, dismissed, and discounted, those living with dementia. How are we going to see the value that others don't see, including in themselves, with the fear and projection that we sometimes make with this? And of course, dementia is tough. So there is a massive opportunity for the rising generation of pro-life leaders to do cultural entrepreneurship from an advocacy standpoint, from a practical standpoint, from a ministry standpoint, from a business standpoint, to meet the needs of people living with dementia. I think that's going to be one of the most pro-life demands and urgent issues of the 21st century that we experience.
Wow. I didn't even think of, yeah.
Well, thank you for that call to action, Amanda. I mean, I guess one thing that reminds me right before we wrap up is that I think it's Colorado actually has had 1 or 2 documented cases of assisted suicide for, I want to say it's anorexia. And so this idea that just a mental health issue could be enough for the state to offer you suicide, we really do need to recognize the humanity and that we're each made in God's image. Did you bring a Bible verse that you'd like to share?
Or any final.
Or anything.
Any final.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about from Genesis 50:20, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So I've been reflecting on that in light, honestly, of Miriam's story and the fact that I was just sharing Miriam's story with the seniors ministry group. I said, isn't that kind of her story as well? That even though there was this intent to harm her through this offer of euthanasia, God turned this around and made her the protagonist who, in order to preserve a numerous people, her story has gone super viral. It's been published in 12 outlets. It's been published in Polish, Italian, Spanish language publications. What seems harmful can be turned around. And for me, with the short films that I produced through the Dying to Meet You project, it is an attempt to take those who are the most affected and the least represented in our public discourse surrounding euthanasia, those who have pretty tough stories. Like I think of Christopher, whose father was euthanized, and it's a dark, tough story. But what gives him the courage to share it is he says, sometimes you just have to speak out. And this is the intending for good that happens when people speak out, when they live in truth. Even the most kind of dark issues can be turned around for the life of the world, for the health of the community. And I would just encourage people to keep that in mind, that rather than hiding those wounds, rather than burying those traumas, think about the ways in which they can actually be reoriented toward goodness and truth, toward reviving others and making more and more people prosper and flourish in unexpected ways.
Yeah. And I think when I think of Miriam, Moses's big sister, and how like Moses and all those um, Israelite boys were intended to be like
They're being killed.
They were being killed by like the Pharaoh's orders, but Moses's life was preserved and, you know, went to
by her courageous act.
Yeah.
I imagine that she could have gotten in big trouble for that.
Think of that, like
that
life was preserved and went on. So, where can people find you, Amanda, and find the Dying to Meet You project?
Yeah, so check out dyingtomeetyou.com, and there you can see links to all the various vignettes of people's stories, from a woman who got a tattoo that says "Don't euthanize me" on her arm, right in her 80s, to family members speaking out about losing their adult children and grandchildren speaking out about losing their parents and grandparents to this, to a woman named Joan living with dementia, who I interviewed alongside her daughter. That one's called Remember to Love. Disability perspectives. It takes all voices. And so I'm also encouraging people, you have people in your own community. How can you amplify them and give them a platform? Bring people from the periphery and give them a platform. People living with disabilities, people living with dementia, people who might be regarded by others as having a life that is less worth living. How do we do the exact opposite of devaluing life? Well, we give them a platform through social media, through opportunities to provide testimony in the community. Let's always be thinking, how do we do the opposite of whatever we consider dehumanizing? That has been the thread of my entire life. What's the opposite of dehumanization? Ever since that question was put on my heart, it has guided every decision educationally and professionally.
Wow. Just a little question. Do you ever feel like you're in a dystopian novel? Because some of these themes are like straight out of, some sci-fi, nightmare. So I don't know if you ever thought about that.
There are a lot of things that people recommend to me, movies, books, that basically are dystopias about euthanasia. And there are a lot of them I haven't watched and a lot of them that I haven't read, partly because I think I'm already saturated in this content through news articles and through real life. Like, I don't need to read a kind of satirical, hypothetical situation. We are in many ways living it. And I think it's important to consider, will those stories still have resonance in terms of the dystopia that they were seeking to depict in a desensitized age that has kind of found its way into expressing some of them? That's where, like, we've got to throw our attention. So we have to ask, what fundamentally was dystopian about those dystopian novels? Do we know? Can we diagnose? Because just as the facts of history alone do not teach morality, the literary flair does not alone kind of convey what is unethical and really at stake in the human drama. So great to work with works of fiction as alongside real things. One of my favorite things, I guess I'll just add this, one of my favorite things to do is to juxtapose two examples and let people say what they prefer, what they think is more attractive and better. So I recently led a workshop where I showed a dying with dignity video of a woman who was getting ready for her choiceful death date and opting for MAID. And so this is the equivalent of Compassion and Choices in Canada, Dying with Dignity. I showed a promo video. And then I showed a video of a woman who was dying of cancer in a state that has assisted suicide. And she was saying, I won't do it because my life is not mine to take, it's mine to give. And because how a story ends changes the meaning of every page. Now, if you had only watched the first one, it seems very convincing. It's beautifully shot, it's winsomely told. It is quite compelling in its own right, and to an untrained, kind of unreflective mind. But when you show them in contrast, when you juxtapose a more positive alternative vision I think the comparison is much sharper. The moral clarity comes into focus. So that's what I would encourage as well, especially in the work of education, which is important for all ages. Drive home the juxtaposition, show the contrast, trust your audience enough to make distinctions and moral judgments in this way. That is, I think, how we will raise up more clear-sighted people in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. Wow.
Yeah, thanks for coming by. This is very educational, and I just love the work you're doing.
Yeah.
Thanks for all you do as well. It's a joy to be a part of the conversation.
Yep. In Canada and the whole world. Yes. Thank you. All right. Well, that's our very full, very so much to think about episode for today. Thank you everyone for joining us, and be ever living.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Ever Living podcast, a podcast by New Hampshire Right-to-Life, New Hampshire's oldest and most active pro-life organization. You can learn more about our work and learn how to get involved at www.nhrtl.org. If you would like to donate to our mission, you can make a donation at www.nhrtl.org/donate. See you next week. May God bless you and be very near to you, and may you be ever living.